For centuries, the pattern has been the same. A dominant system rises not through force alone, but through structure. It builds rules that favor its expansion, institutions that reinforce its authority, and financial mechanisms that quietly pull value inward. Trade flows follow its gravity. Capital trusts its stability. Over time, the system stops needing to conquer. Others voluntarily align themselves to it because doing so feels safe, efficient, inevitable. And then, slowly at first, the mechanics change. The system begins to consume more than it produces. Its financial institutions grow more complex, more abstract, and more detached from the real economy they were built to serve. Debt replaces discipline. Confidence replaces restraint. The appearance of wealth expands even as the underlying capacity to generate it begins to erode. This moment is never dramatic. It rarely makes headlines. In fact, it often looks like success. History shows that decline does not announce itself with panic. It arrives disguised as normalcy, as continuity, as the belief that scale itself has become a form of security. Empires do not collapse because they are attacked. They collapse because their internal incentives invert. What once rewarded productivity begins to reward leverage. What once punished excess begins to subsidize it. Capital stops circulating through labor and innovation and instead pools inside financial instruments designed to preserve status rather than create value. The critical shift is subtle but fatal. Wealth flows through the system, but no longer stays within it. At that point, the system becomes dependent not on strength, but on belief. Belief that debts will always roll forward. Belief that currencies will always be accepted. Belief that counterparties will never question the underlying balance sheet. Every major collapse in recorded history follows this arc. From ancient trade empires that debased their coinage to sustain military reach, to financial hegemonies that replaced production with credit creation, the sequence remains remarkably consistent. Expansion, financialization, overconfidence, fragility. And somewhere outside the center of power, other actors are always watching. They study the incentives. They observe where value leaks. They notice when rules designed to protect stability instead begin to generate risk. They do not challenge the system directly. They do not announce alternatives. They simply prepare structures that benefit from the imbalance. By the time the dominant institutions realize what has happened, the advantage has already shifted. Not through conquest, not through collapse, but through accounting. In every era, the final stage begins the same way. The leading financial centers are still busy. Markets still function. Banks still clear transactions. Officials still speak in the language of control. But beneath the surface, the system is no longer compounding strength. It is compounding exposure. And once that threshold is crossed, outcomes stop being a matter of policy choice. They become a matter of arithmetic. That is where this story begins. Not at the moment of crisis, but long before it becomes visible. At the point where incentives quietly diverge, balance sheets begin telling a different story than narratives, and a $6 trillion advantage is built without firing a single shot. Because by the time the pattern is obvious, it is already too late to change how it ends. Large-scale systemic collapse rarely looks like collapse while it is happening. In reality, it begins as an economic process long before it becomes social or political. The visible institutions remain intact. Elections still occur. Corporations still report profits. Markets still open on time. What changes is not the surface, but the function beneath it. At the earliest stage, a system experiences genuine success. Productivity rises, trade expands, and financial instruments emerge to efficiently allocate capital. Money remains closely tied to real output. Debt exists, but it is limited by cultural norms, institutional restraint, and the expectation that obligations must eventually be settled. The second stage begins when scale itself becomes a justification for risk. As the system grows larger, it gains the ability to borrow more cheaply, roll debts more easily, and absorb short-term imbalances without immediate consequence. Financial innovation accelerates. Credit expands faster than production. This is still perceived as strength. In the third stage, incentives quietly shift. Institutions learn that returns can be generated more reliably through leverage than through productivity. Financial activity becomes increasingly self-referential, feeding on asset appreciation rather than value creation. Debt is no longer a tool. It becomes a dependency. The fourth stage is normalization. What would once have been considered dangerous becomes routine. Balance sheets expand without corresponding increases in real output. Policymakers reassure rather than restrain. Risk models are adjusted to fit outcomes rather than reality. The system feels stable precisely because instability has not yet arrived. The fifth stage is fragility disguised as resilience. Small shocks no longer cleanse excess. They are absorbed and deferred. Intervention replaces correction. Capital flows toward instruments perceived as protected rather than productive. Wealth concentrates, not because of efficiency, but because the system rewards proximity to financial infrastructure over contribution to output. At this point, collapse is no longer a sudden event. It is a condition. The system still functions, but only as long as confidence remains unbroken. Debt must continuously expand to prevent contraction. Trust must be maintained to avoid repricing. Any interruption becomes existential. The final stage arrives not with panic, but with irreversibility. Options narrow. Trade-offs harden. Choices that once could have been made gradually now require disruption to implement at all. What was flexible becomes rigid. What was manageable becomes arithmetic. This framework is not theoretical. It appears with remarkable consistency across empires, currencies, and financial regimes, separated by centuries and geography. The names change, the technologies change, the language becomes more sophisticated, but the mechanics remain. Most importantly, collapse is not caused by ignorance or malice. It emerges when incentives reward behavior that weakens the system while appearing to strengthen it. When participants act rationally within structures that are no longer sustainable. And it is always during this phase, when the system still feels dominant, sophisticated, and secure, that the most consequential shifts occur elsewhere, quietly, patiently, without confrontation. Because collapse does not require an external enemy. It only requires time, misaligned incentives, and someone willing to build advantage while others are still managing appearances. The Roman Empire did not fall when its borders were breached. It fell when its internal economics stopped working. At its height, Rome possessed structural advantages unmatched in the ancient world. A unified legal system, standardized currency, vast trade networks, and military dominance allowed wealth to flow inward from 3 continents. Roads connected production to markets. Taxes were predictable. Coinage was trusted. For centuries, Rome did not merely conquer territory. It integrated it into an economic system that extracted value efficiently and redistributed it just enough to maintain order. But success changed the incentives. As expansion slowed, Rome faced a problem it had never needed to solve before. The empire's costs were fixed, but its inflows were no longer growing. The military still required funding. The bureaucracy still expanded. Urban populations still demanded subsidies. Productivity at the core declined even as consumption rose. Rather than contract, Rome chose distortion. Silver content in coinage was gradually reduced. Not suddenly, not openly, but incrementally. The currency continued to circulate, but its real value eroded. Prices rose, trust weakened, trade increasingly relied on barter or foreign coin. The state maintained the appearance of solvency while quietly hollowing out its monetary foundation. Debt followed. Obligations to soldiers, officials, and suppliers accumulated. Taxes increased, but higher taxation reduced incentives to produce. Small landholders were crushed, while large estates absorbed their land and relied on slave labor rather than innovation. Productivity stagnated. Wealth flowed through Rome, but it no longer stayed within productive channels. The social consequences were predictable. The middle class, the backbone of Roman stability, collapsed. Urban populations grew dependent on state distributions. Rural regions emptied. Economic activity concentrated around political power rather than economic contribution. Most critically, Rome lost monetary discipline at the exact moment it needed it most. Foreign traders demanded payment in hard currency. Mercenaries required compensation that held value. The empire increasingly exported gold and silver to pay for goods it no longer produced competitively. Wealth did not disappear. It migrated outward. By the time Rome attempted reforms, the system had hardened. Diocletian imposed price controls. Constantine restructured currency. These actions addressed symptoms, not causes. Confidence had already fractured. Incentives had already shifted. The economy functioned, but only under coercion rather than trust. Rome did not collapse overnight. It persisted for generations in a weakened state, administratively complex, but economically brittle. Its institutions survived long after its capacity to sustain them had vanished. The lesson is not that Rome was mismanaged. It is that Rome followed incentives that once made sense and eventually became fatal. Expansion rewarded distortion. Stability rewarded complacency. Power insulated decision-makers from feedback. And while Roman elites focused inward on preserving status, appearances, and control, value was quietly rebalancing beyond the empire's center. The system did not fail because wealth stopped moving. It failed because wealth stopped compounding at home, and that same dynamic would reappear centuries later, in a very different world, under far more sophisticated financial assumptions, where confidence, not coinage, became the currency of belief. In the early 20th century, the British Empire believed it had transcended history. London was the financial center of the world. Sterling was the global reserve currency. British banks financed trade across continents. Insurance, shipping, commodities, and credit all cleared through institutions that had operated continuously for generations. The empire no longer needed to manufacture everything it consumed. Its strength, it believed, lay in coordination, finance, and trust. This time, the system was different. Britain had learned from past empires. Its institutions were professionalized. Its central bank was respected. Its legal system was the foundation of international commerce. Capital flowed into London not because of coercion, but because of confidence, and for a time that confidence was justified. But the same pattern reasserted itself under new conditions. 2 world wars hollowed out Britain's productive base. Debt exploded to sustain military commitments and imperial obligations. Rather than allow the currency to adjust naturally, policymakers fought to preserve sterling's prestige. They returned to the gold standard at an overvalued rate, prioritizing financial credibility over economic reality. The result was deflation, unemployment, and stagnation at home. British industry struggled to compete. Productivity lagged. Consumption was increasingly financed through borrowing and external capital rather than output. The empire still looked dominant on maps and balance sheets, but its internal capacity to generate surplus had eroded. Meanwhile, belief sustained the system longer than fundamentals justified. Sterling remained widely used. British banks still intermediated global trade. Foreign governments held British debt because it felt safe, familiar, established. The delay between structural weakness and visible consequence created the illusion of permanence. Denial followed naturally. Warnings were dismissed as temporary dislocations. Decline was framed as cyclical rather than structural. The belief that this time is different rested on the sophistication of institutions rather than the health of the underlying economy. But arithmetic does not negotiate. As obligations mounted and reserves drained, Britain was forced to confront reality. Sterling was devalued. Capital controls were imposed. The empire gradually dissolved, not in a single collapse, but through a managed retreat masked as reform. London remained important. British institutions survived. But the center of gravity had shifted. The decisive factor was not war, nor diplomacy, nor ideology. It was that Britain had attempted to preserve financial dominance after losing productive dominance. Wealth continued to flow through its system, but increasing amounts flowed outward to pay for goods, energy, and security it no longer produced efficiently. The pattern repeated exactly as before. Belief delayed adjustment. Prestige substituted for discipline. Financial complexity obscured structural decline, and when correction finally arrived, it was framed as unavoidable rather than chosen. This case matters not because Britain failed, but because it believed failure was no longer possible. And it is at precisely this point in the cycle, when institutions feel mature, rational, and immune, that the most consequential modern parallel begins to take shape, not in rhetoric or ideology, but in balance sheets, reserves, and quietly accumulated advantages that few were watching closely enough to see. Late-stage systems always feel most convincing right before they change. This is not coincidence. It is the result of accumulated adaptations designed to suppress visible stress. Institutions learn how to smooth volatility, how to reframe risk, how to extend timelines. Each intervention works until it doesn't. And because each one delays consequences, it reinforces the belief that consequences have been mastered. Stability becomes a managed outcome rather than an emergent one. Warnings are not ignored, they are absorbed. Risks are acknowledged, then neutralized through language, models, and temporary measures that quietly become permanent. What once would have triggered correction now triggers accommodation. Losses are socialized. Liquidity replaces discipline. Time is borrowed repeatedly from the future. This is the acceleration phase. It is marked by narrative control rather than reform, by the insistence that complexity itself ensures safety, by confidence that institutions are too central, too interconnected, too necessary to be allowed to fail. The system appears calm, not because risk is low, but because risk has been normalized. Participants adapt their behavior accordingly. Banks extend duration. Governments expand obligations. Corporations prioritize financial optimization over productive investment. Individuals adjust expectations downward while leverage moves upward. Each actor behaves rationally within the incentives provided, even as the aggregate outcome becomes increasingly unstable. Crucially, the cost of reversal rises with every delay. Early corrections are painful but manageable. Late corrections are destabilizing. As balance sheets expand and interdependencies deepen, options narrow. What could once be adjusted gradually must now be defended aggressively. The system becomes brittle not from weakness, but from scale. This is why late-stage systems punish honesty. Those who speak in structural terms are dismissed as pessimistic or outdated. Those who propose restraint are framed as irresponsible. The narrative must remain intact because belief itself has become a form of collateral. And yet, beneath the surface, preparation continues elsewhere. Actors less invested in preserving the narrative quietly position for volatility. They build buffers instead of projections, redundancy instead of efficiency, control instead of return. They do not attempt to predict the moment of change, because timing is irrelevant when structure is the signal. When acceleration ends, it does not feel like collapse at first. It feels like confusion. Liquidity behaves strangely. Correlations break. Assumptions fail without explanation. The models still run, but the outputs no longer make sense. By then, the window for deliberate adjustment has closed. What remains is motion driven not by choice, but by momentum, where those dependent on continuity scramble to preserve it, and those prepared for discontinuity simply continue operating. The system does not fall apart. It reorders itself. History does not repeat because people are foolish or malicious. It repeats because incentives endure. Every system is built to reward certain behaviors and discourage others. Over time, participants adapt perfectly to those signals. Productivity gives way to leverage. Discipline yields to optimization. Stability becomes a goal rather than a byproduct. None of this requires bad intent. It requires only that short-term rewards remain detached from long-term sustainability. This is why cycles persist across centuries and technologies. Empires rise by aligning effort with reward. They decline when that alignment breaks, not suddenly but gradually, until adjustment becomes structurally impossible without disruption. At that point, outcomes are no longer governed by leadership quality or policy creativity, but by accumulated constraints. The modern financial order is not unique in this respect. Its tools are more advanced. Its language is more refined. Its institutions are larger and more interconnected than any before it. But its incentives are familiar. Consumption has been rewarded more than production. Expansion has been favored over consolidation. Confidence has been treated as an input rather than an output. These choices did not feel reckless at the time. They felt rational within a system designed to delay consequences. China's advantage, often framed as strategic brilliance, is better understood as structural patience. By prioritizing capacity over returns, control over liquidity, and resilience over elegance, it positioned itself differently within the same global architecture. It did not reject the system. It studied it. It accepted the benefits while quietly mitigating the risks that others normalized. This does not make one side virtuous and the other flawed. It reveals how different incentive environments produce different outcomes over time. As systems mature, flexibility diminishes. Adaptation becomes harder. Narratives harden, and eventually the cycle resolves, not through catastrophe alone, but through rebalancing that redistributes influence toward those least dependent on the previous configuration. The lesson is not predictive. It does not offer timelines or outcomes. It offers perspective. History does not move in straight lines. It moves through phases shaped by incentives, constraints, and human behavior that changes far less than our tools do. Those who understand this do not panic. They observe. Because the future is not decided by intentions, nor by declarations of strength. It is decided by structure. If you're watching for the first time, welcome to the Economy Club. This is where we study the forces that shape history and the patterns that quietly decide the future. Stay curious, stay grounded, and we'll see you in the next cycle.